Good morning, everybody. Howdy. Welcome to Friends Talking. Joshua Daniel is headed off to seminary. So we're going to talk a little bit about how all of this happened. So tell a little bit, Josh, about your upbringing, how faith began in you.
Okay, wow.
And let's kind of tell a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so I grew up in the area in Bentonville, just up the road, and my parents both moved in just before I was born, one from Illinois and one from New York. They met in college. And they started a church. They left the Southern Baptist Church in Bentonville and started a church with 7 other families called Fellowship Bible Church. I don't know if you guys have heard of this church, but it is enormous now. It's got like 20,000 people or something in Rogers. And when they started, I was the only kid in the nursery. But church was a central part of our life. We were always at church, and when we weren't at church, the people at church were with us wherever we were, you know. And Fellowship had a deeply positive impact in my upbringing. I was very involved with everything that I could be involved in. You know, one of the things that Fellowship really drilled into my head was they had this saying that it's not about form, it's about function. And so the idea was the church could look any different type of way, but there was like some of these basic functions that church was really aimed at. And that allowed me to have interest in the Episcopal Church. When I left, I went to school in Greenville College, and the college was loosely associated with a small denomination called the Free Methodists. And the Free Methodists were kind of sliding into kind of bland evangelicalism in the last 10 years before I got there. And so the religion department, who were all Free Methodists, but all got their PhDs at St. Louis University, which is a Catholic place, decided that, not that they had had enough exactly, but they started another Free Methodist church in the town that I went to of like 7,000 people. So, and they used the Book of Common Prayer for their service.
Yeah.
So that was my first introduction to Anglicanism. And then I went to England for school for just a semester and went to an Anglican church there. And and then after college, Jen and I were living in St. Louis, and we wanted to join a church that we could, as we moved, still be a part of it. So even then, we weren't focused exactly on the Episcopal Church, but it was the first church that we went to in St. Louis, in this wonderful neighborhood of Tower Grove, St. John's. And we found a home there, and so that was kind of the beginning of that.
I'm wondering, do the folks at St. John's in Tower Grove know you're headed off to seminary?
Yeah, they do.
Good,
Mother
good.
Teresa is the pastor there.
Oh, good name.
And, yes, exactly. My first formation was by Mother Teresa, you know.
And, not many people can say that.
Right, exactly. She was the first person that I told I wanted to be a priest.
Yeah.
Back in 2005, and she had this incredibly enthusiastic response to me and said, look, anything I can do to help. Jen and I came back to Arkansas because we both were wanting to go to graduate school, and we applied to several different areas, and Fayetteville worked out best for both of us. And so I ended up not going, obviously, through discernment in St. Louis. But yeah, Jenna's family still lives in Illinois, so we pass through St. Louis 3 or 4 times a year, and I've got to see her a couple times as a pastor, and have the church, interestingly, has been a kind of Canterbury Road for many of the people coming out of Greenville College, is where I went, to the Episcopal Church. There's now like a dozen Episcopalians there that all came from Greenville. And so she has had a tremendous impact on that place.
So what are some of the things that led you to say, my home is with the Episcopal Church?
Wow, yeah. So they had their, our class is the Inquirers class for newcomers who are interested in being a part of the church. And theirs was called like Via Media or something.
Yeah.
And they had like a video series of people talking about it. And at that point, so here's the deal, like, I had studied philosophy for 4 years, and what I had thought, I had a degree in philosophy, and what I thought about kind of life after that was everything is intellectual gamesmanship, you know? I thought that kind of, at base, all the arguments had the same kind of lightness to them. And I thought about church at the time, that churches were about that same type of kind of intellectual gamesmanship, but just applied to theology. You know, who could come up with the most, I don't know, coherent or foundational theology. And so when I thought about...
So the best theology wins?
Yes, yeah, exactly, exactly. But like, what's the best? The best is a type of gamesmanship, not because it's rooted in truth or anything like that. And so when we started, I was very interested in becoming a part of the Episcopal Church, but not because of anything particularly about the Episcopal Church, because I thought all of that was kind of, real superfluous. But I went in wanting to be Episcopalian. So I went into this Via Media series thinking like, look, whatever you guys want to tell me, I'm up for it, you know? Like, just tell me the things I need to recite, and I'm like in for it, you know? Because I really did think it was a type of like gamesmanship. So I was like, whatever, you know, just give me the script. And well, we got to the week on doctrine, and I'm sure it wasn't this blunt. I'm sure it was more nuanced. But what I heard was, oh, in the Episcopal Church, we don't believe anything.
Ooh.
You know, or no, we don't have a doctrine. There's no doctrine in the Episcopal Church, and therefore that we don't believe anything referred to doctrine. And I was devastated, you know, because I was ready to like, whatever our doctrine was, to defend it, but it looks like there isn't any, you know? So that really shook me. That really was a moment of like, what, you know? And so my first reaction, kind of coming out of a conservative background, was to think that the Episcopal Church had like acquiesced into this kind of postmodern feeling fest of you believe what you believe and I believe what I believe, and we'll just call it a day. And that was really not cool with me, you know? I was ready for like the hard stuff, even though I didn't think it was like rooted in anything. I was ready for the hard stuff, you know? Man, and that church was really formational for me because, and for Jenna too, I think. And so what led me out of that? The next week was on the history or something, and you know, I'm sure I'm going to get the details wrong, but the history as I understood it was, you know, there had been lots of religious turnover in England, and King Henry was eighth that had come into power, and you know, through both religious moves but also political, he kicked the Catholic Church out and then died, and his daughter Mary brought the Catholic Church back, and then Elizabeth took over. And the idea behind the Book of Common Prayer was, look, how can we get both these groups of people to worship together? And instead of placing on doctrine, which is the only category that I had for the basis of church, you know, like what is your doctrine as the basis, let's form a church based on prayer. And man, that lesson went to the heart of me, and I started thinking of myself as Episcopalian from that day on. So,
as a people that can pray together, even as they don't come to a large body of agreed upon doctrine that everybody must believe in order to belong.
Yes. So, you know, after my extensive knowledge of studying philosophy for 4 years. I just knew there was no getting the doctrine right, and therefore I didn't think that there would ever really be a true basis to church, and had never heard someone articulate, even though there's a very strong affinity with fellowship on this point, that the function of church, which I think even they would articulate, is based in prayer, is kind of the more foundational part. And fellowship, I don't know really a whole lot about the church right now, but when I was there wasn't a strong emphasis on, you better believe these things. I think lots of the people there did that, had these things that they thought were the fundamental doctrines, but going through the youth group and their youth programs, they taught me how to pray, and that was the kind of fundamental part of spirituality. And so it really served me as I transitioned to semi-adulthood.
Yeah. So now you are finishing a degree in philosophy.
Yeah.
And so you have been immersed in a very deep path of learning and research and writing. Tell a little bit about that and how that's impacted you personally and how that impacts this vocation toward priesthood.
Yeah, okay. Well, one of the things that I really love about our church and about our faith in general is the emphasis on being on a journey, and we don't have an idea of being Christian as happening on July 5th, 1985, but it's something that we're in constant renewal about and understanding. Anyway, so even though I felt like some of those early lessons about what church is like began back at St. Louis, my view of philosophy was still very fragmented from my faith. I didn't think that there was a lot of overlap. Again, partly because I thought of philosophy as, again, it's kind of funny. I'm not sure I really had put it together in these words before, but philosophy being a discipline focused on right doctrine, about trying to come up with the right set of theories about philosophy of mind, about the mind, or how language works, or justice, or any number of things. And so, yeah, I thought, I was doing philosophy because it paid the bills, It was like the worst way to wealth in the history of humankind, but they offered me a job, and I really liked it, but I didn't really see it as, I knew that there was a part of philosophy that did religion, but that's as far as it had intersected to me. So what I've really valued about my degree is I studied a person named Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was this Austrian philosopher born in 1889 and then taught at Cambridge after the war. Just this really incredible guy, has an insane story. His father was the richest man in Europe before World War II in Vienna. He grew up in this palace. Brahms taught his brother how to play the piano. His sister was psychoanalyzed by Freud. Their house was like the center of European culture. Their house was. But his father was this kind of crass industrialist and put a ton of pressure on his sons to do the same thing. And 3 of his 4 brothers committed suicide. Wittgenstein himself contemplated suicide very seriously until he went to study in England and read Bertrand Russell's The Foundations of Mathematics and thought he was wrong, and therefore there was a point to his life.
To prove Bertrand Russell wrong.
The math literally saved him, And but what's interesting about Wittgenstein is that for him, philosophy is not about the accumulation and the defense of doctrine or theses, but a way of living. And this was very early on in his philosophy, continued through his life. And so what has been really great about my graduate program is that I've spent it's been 9 years really trying to get a fundamental grasp of Wittgenstein, which eluded me forever. I mean, I felt like I was getting a really great parochial understanding of Wittgenstein. I could understand this part and this part, but had no idea really how they was all connected. And it took just years of returning to him and working it out. I restarted my dissertation, don't tell Jen I haven't told her this, twice. Sorry. I would write, 20 or 50 pages and set it aside and return to the source material and felt like I still wasn't getting it and start over, and I did that a couple of times. Before I felt like I was getting. So what was really nice, how it connects, is because I think in some ways it doesn't really matter, it's not important to me, but in some really important ways, there's this kind of deep spirituality to Wittgenstein, I think, and being able to understand his philosophy from this kind of fundamental point, and also to our church, again, about not just our church, but our faith, I really think, is strongly anti-dogmatic about the defense of particular positions. And so that's kind of a answer to that.
So I hear in you, in that whole process of coming to try to understand Wittgenstein, but also it sounds like you were looking for his spirituality as well.
Yeah.
I hear in Josh there's been a head path and a heart path, and they've always been together, but not necessarily correlative, not necessarily.
Yeah.
Tell me about head and heart coming together inside of Josh.
Yeah, so I did debate in high school, which was really great for me. It was like one of the most things that prepared me for college. And this was probably the beginning of the view I thought about our church and about philosophy, about the kind of gamesmanship of positions. That's what debate was all about. And I'm not it's not to give debate a hard time, but to me it seemed to slide over to just about everything, that it was all gamesmanship. So one of the things that Wittgenstein helped me see, he has several places in both his early work and late work where he'll say something like this. When we try to do philosophy, and this is kind of philosophy in the bad sense, what we're doing is we're taking practices that we try to that we think that we understand, and we're trying to generalize over them. And so Wittgenstein both thinks that we do awful about the generalizations. So for my students, I taught several classes at the university and at the community college, and to try to drive this point home to them, I would try to take something that they were all intimately familiar with, like, for instance, love, right? Love towards friends or parents or a spouse, and ask them to write a couple sentences about what makes love so important. Not to them, but just like, what is love, right? And I'd collect them up, and we'd read some of them. And after just a few moments of reflection, we all realized that, we didn't have any great words for that description. They were either too narrowly focused or too broad to be not just about love, but also, I don't know, something seemingly unrelated. So Wittgenstein both thought that we were really not great at generalization, but that doesn't mean to him that there isn't true understanding in us. So he would want to say, although he doesn't really talk about love, that clearly love is a force in our lives, is something that we deeply understand, but also that we're not very great about articulating. And that really rings true to me, both about love, but also about lots of the important things. If you asked me to say a few words about what makes parenting so joyful for me, I might come up with particular examples, but I probably do a really bad job talking about parenting, even though I feel like there's a sense of it in which it's really a part of me and something I, deeply connect to. So being able to apply that rule to things like faith and this was just true of me for so long about faith, like I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know, I felt very comfortable in church, I felt very comfortable kind of in philosophy talking about it, but I felt like they were not exactly at odds, but like two ships passing the night. That the type of language we use in church was not the type of language that we use in the discipline, or at least that I was familiar with. And so Wittgenstein really trying to connect those 2 points. And the heart and the head is an interesting way to think about that. And trying to work those things together has been a part of my kind of academic vocation.
So it sounds like underneath all of this, there's always been for you an affinity with mystery. There's been that room for mystery. It sounds like in your own journey. And also in those places in philosophy that have drawn you, where we have the experience, but the words will never match the reality.
Yeah. So Wittgenstein's first work, his only published work, which he wrote in the trenches of World War I. He asked to be moved to the front. He felt like that's where he wrote the clearest, And he was captured. He fought for whatever the non-Britain American side was. Axis allies, I can never remember the Axis, right? And he was captured, and he was in a prison camp in Italy for a while, and he was really afraid that he was going to lose his book, that they were going to confiscate it or something, and so he snuck it out to Bertrand Russell. Anyway, so Wittgenstein wrote this book about the foundations, ostensibly about mathematics and logic, and it's filled with propositions like the general form of a proposition is such and such. Well, at the end of it, he says, if you've truly understood me, you will see that these propositions are nonsense, and that the most appropriate thing basically to do is to throw this book away once you've understood it. And let me tell you, when you work through this book, yes, there really, I think there is a real affinity there. But if you work through this book, I mean, it will take, it took me at least years, and getting to the end, and him saying, look, just leave it alone is kind of disheartening, But yeah, I really do think that there is, at the end of my dissertation, and part of what really excites me about seminary is that for Wittgenstein, again, we're bad at the descriptions, well, what do we look at? And for him, it's to look at the practices, to look at where things really meet the road. And so it's not just apply for religion, but he wants to look at language. It's really easy for us to generalize about what makes language function well, what's the meaning of language. For him, it's looking at the particular uses, right? So, for instance, there's a great philosopher named Stanley Cavell who has written on this, and they'll make points, it's called ordinary language philosophy, and they'll make points like, why does it make sense to say I'm not going to do it. Oh, yes. Feed Ruby, but also feed a parking meter, right? There's something really connected there, right? It's not just bark and bark, like a dog barks and a tree bark. There's something that really connects these two, and what is it? So it's not going to be pretty, it's going to be messy, but let's really look at how language is working, and that's what we should be interested in, not the general theory. So applying that to religion, we're not going to be interested in the general theories about religion, about whatever. We're going to look at how God, belief in the incarnation, belief in the Trinity, works in our lives, works in our church, works in our personal, it works in the Bible, works in the history. Anyway, so to be able to go to seminary with this kind of philosophical background, to look at the practices in this very kind of, in some ways, rigid way is really exciting to me. But one of the things that I've done at the end of my dissertation is to explore a spirituality of silence, which is a part of our faith. And I think in some ways Wittgenstein would deeply appreciate that type of spirituality. And Henry Nouwen has this really great chapter in a book on the importance of silence. And Laura Walsh helped us lead at St. Martin's a book discussion on the celebration of discipline, which is this really great book, like problematic in some ways, obviously, but deeply spiritual. And there's a chapter on silence. You guys can help me out. It's not called silence, it's called something else, but halfway through he says it really should be about silence. And part of it is, Kierkegaard has this great quote, and he quotes Kierkegaard in it, and Kierkegaard says, Christ tells us to go to all the nations proclaiming his name, so what should we do? And he says, well, should we become missionaries and go across the land? No, we should first love God and love people. Well, should we create churches in our own hometown? And he says, no, we should love God. And it just goes through all the different options, and there's this sense of like, we will never better express our faith other than the living out of Christ's love for us in our lives. And like the trying to justify that or explain it cheapens it in a way. I'm not saying I fully agree with that, but there's something really interesting about that, and interesting about the spirituality of silence in that way.
Yeah, to write about silence is kind of odd.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, yes, yeah, exactly. What do you say about that? I mean, so all of these articles about the Tractatus, there's this, I call it like a self-undermining character, because if you're really into that, then the thing is to stop, and there's a sense to that, but there's also a sense in which it needs to be articulated.
So what is some of the practice that's been formative for you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's been, something that I remember. I went through 2 different discernments at St. Paul's. One when we first moved here early on, and I remember them asking me that question. So, can I back up to how the call to priesthood started for me? It was at St. John's at the church in St. Louis, and had always loved the church. Faith had always played a deeply formative part of my life, but I never thought I wanted to be a pastor all the way through college, partly because, again, this isn't fellowship's fault exactly, but how I perceived it as a child was that the pastor was involved in like organizing Sunday services, and also some social functions. And that just wasn't interesting to me. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't good for some people to do. Clearly, I thought that it was, but it wasn't interesting to me. I think maybe you could call it, again, kind of me dividing the heart and the head into this. At the time, I wanted to be a poverty lawyer. I thought I was going to go to law school and like work in the streets, and did a lot of urban ministry when I was in Chicago and in St. Louis. Again, if the arguments are all kind of gamesmanship, let's just get into the streets and like help people, And the service, there was a moment in my life when I felt called to the priesthood, and that moment was during the Feast of St. Francis. And again, it was my first year in the Episcopal Church, the first time to be at, what's another name for the feast?
The Blessing of the Animals?
Blessing of the Animals, yeah. And so we were at church, and like dogs were showing up and cats, and I was like, what is going on? I mean, I was super into like literally it's gone to the dogs, what has happened here. And at some point in that service, it like occurred to me, I'm sure it was something that somebody said, it was like not an insight on my part, but somebody made a point that the Episcopal Church is not just interested in your lives here during the couple hours, but we are interested in your lives full stop, you know. And so part of the tradition of this is, as a community, as a church, we are going to bless the animals for which our livelihood depends, because the animals are just as much a part of our lives. And that was radical to me, but it had struck a chord of truth. And it was like in that moment, I mean, as strange as it is to think that the inclusion of pets and animals into the service was kind of like the bridge that was laid for me to see myself as a priest in the church, but it was. And so since then, it's been a process. The practices have been trying to fully integrate my life and my life in the world and my spirit life as one. So I remember for discernment, you know, and this went through, again, like the generalizations were like not good, but I remember them asking me the similar type of question, like what's the, what are some of your practices? And I was like, practice number one, I try to walk my dogs for at least an hour every day, you know? And I was like, this is a deep part of my spirituality, and it was at the time. But to many of their ears, I mean, they could obviously really appreciate that, but they were like, but that's your prayer life? We don't understand, you know? And I was like, I don't either, you know? But there wasn't much awareness on my part of like how that might be like, wait, what's going on? Like, why are you wanting to be a priest, though? And so since then, there's been a series of me really trying to integrate things like on the offices into part of my life.
And the offices are the daily office, like morning prayer.
Yeah. So honestly, like, again, so this is a really interesting kind of bringing the heart and head together. Like, I hated exercise, you know, forever. Like, I liked playing basketball, and so when I was playing basketball through junior high and high school, I was a pretty healthy person, but when I stopped, I was like, I'm not going outside to run, you know? Like, I will run if the house is on fire or if I'm being chased by a bear or something, but I just, like, and this is not, like, I'm not about, what I'm about to say is not because I think it's true, but I felt like exercise was just so indulgent, you know, so self-indulgent, and I just couldn't, you know, well, that was like bad for me, you know, like bad for my health. And the first few years of graduate school were really bad for that. And so what I, you know, and this is just kind of like a practical thing, I realized that if I could somehow figure out how to like do things like prayer during exercise time became not something that I did as like, I better do this or I'm going to die soon, but like something that I was joyful about, you know? And so I've tried to, kind of fuse, like literally fuse the body worship with the God worship together. And in some ways it's been good for me.
So it seems like this sense of calling has really dogged you.
Yes. Thank you, Lowell. Laughing only encourages them, trust me.
So thoughts or questions here? We've got, oh, golly dog, it's gone fast. Got just a few minutes, so let's see what other thoughts and questions we've got as Vanna White gets the microphone out here. Oop, I think I better use this one. Yes, Adam.
I was just wondering if you would talk to us about like where you are on your journey, as in doctrine, or which way, or...
Yeah. Thanks, Adam.
So what do you believe in 3 minutes?
Right, yeah. So one thing I want to say, and this might be not, I guess it's not my last chance, but this church has been deeply formative to me on every level. Both for me personally as a spiritual matter, but also just with my family. And that our church has such a intentional bringing in of children into the services and in very meaningful ways has just been really great. But one of the reasons I mentioned that is no one has had, besides Wittgenstein and my advisor, more of an influence. It's going to sound like I'm brown-nosing, than Lowell on my dissertation. And the reason for that, partly besides Lowell being great about giving great sermons, is so for Wittgenstein was to turn to the practices. Well, Lowell, always at the center of his homilies is how do we make sense of the incarnation, you know, and just like real sense, and being able to like listen over years to him imaginally doing that was just deeply formative to me on the issue of doctrine. Listening to Lowell and Suzanne and Father Chuck's sermons and paying attention to them has been hugely transformational for me. The other part of that is being asked to do the Inquirer's class, and they asked me to do the one on doctrine. And in having to have something to say to people who are showing up, again, like not about gamesmanship, but really like let's talk about this, forced me to really start to begin to articulate that, and being able to talk to them and hear about like what's important and hear how they're telling me was also another formative part. And so I talked a little bit about that when I did the presentation about the incarnation, about why is it that we call Jesus God? It's not just because there's this long history. A part of that is that the disciples worshipped him. That's a practice of worshiping Jesus. And since we only worship God if we're going to worship Jesus, you know. Anyway, so that's like a key for me on broaching these very kind of seemingly, grand things, and to make them very kind of dirty and real.
So it's time for us to go practice, to stop talking about and begin praying about. And as part of our service coming up, Jude is going to be our assistant verger today. So we want to get him vested and thank him for his leadership and service. And Jenna, thank you so much for all you've brought to us. And y'all have been at the center of this parish and at the center of the life at St. Martin's. And it's the best, healthiest that I've ever known it to be. And people who've been here a long time say the same. Thank you for the gift of revival that you've given to St. Martin's. Everybody put money in the places we have for putting money in. We want to send them off with a good transition. And then come after church. We've got a big picnic, and say hi to Josh and Jenna and the kids and as we send them off. Thank you so much. Time for us to go pray.